Quad mics on these cameras, I think, do an acceptable job of capturing the ambient sounds, but that's only when you're not in a windy situation. Take a look at these examples.
And again, there we go. Come on. There.
We both think they went then. Huh? Both think they dropped it to us.
Obviously, it's up to you to decide whether the inbuilt mics are going to be good enough for your needs. It's probably not going to cut it for a feature film, for example, but I've never had an issue just putting that kind of audio lower down in the mix just to give it some ambience. For interviews though, I'd rather use a shotgun mic boomed over the top of the speaker's head, or otherwise using a lav mic like the Rode Filmmaker kit. In a run and gun situation, a lav sometimes makes a lot more sense than having a shotgun mic. You don't have to worry about getting the stand in place to boom it over them, or have someone else to help you, for example. And this Rode wireless lav mic is a decent option. It's not the smallest kit in the world, but it is really good value. You've got to hide one of these on your talent and then wire the lav mic into position, and that transmits the message to the other box, which goes onto your cold shoe mount on top of the camera, and that then just plugs into the camera's mic port. On the transmitter unit, you can tell it to send a +10 or +20 decibel signal, and on the receiving end, you can either do -10 or -20. What I do is I leave both at 0 and I turn the cameras down to -12 dB to get the cleanest sound. There are alternatives, of course. There are Sennheiser ones, for example, that the industry swears by, but they are much more expensive and these offer decent value and a good signal. There are also budget ones, and although I've not tested those myself, I have heard bad things about interference and signal drops. Serious professionals are probably going to want to use an XLR mic, and that will give the cleanest sound. I think a decent mic close enough to your talent for things like interviews is going to be way more important for your sound quality. Here's a few examples with relatively budget gear just to show you that the preamp is doing some work and you can get a feel for how it performs. The sign of a bad preamp would obviously be poor audio quality, but also you'd get a hissing sound even when there are no sounds being recorded. So let's test. You'll first hear what it sounds like at normal volumes with some speech and on a variety of mics. Now this isn't supposed to be a microphone test, so don't pay too much attention to the actual sound that you're hearing, but try and listen out for that hiss sound and ask yourself whether that's acceptable for your needs. I haven't done any post-processing on that, so obviously you could go further and help these out in post if you wanted to. Rode Video Micro, microphone settings at -9, mic check 1 2, Rode Video Micro, mic check 1 2, Rode Video Micro, mic check, mic check. This is the Budget Boyer lav mic, wired in, connected to the GH5. Microphone's about 5-6 inches from my face. Mic check 1 2, testing 1 2. Mic check. This is the Rode wireless lav. Mic check. How many sound guys does it take to fix a light bulb? 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2. For the second part of the test, I'll stop speaking completely, which is probably good news, and what I'll be doing is bumping up the volume in post so that you can hear the noise floor when there are no sounds being recorded, that hissing sound. Now I'll be doing that at -9 decibels on the camera, where the preamp is doing the least work. We'll go to 0 decibels, and then we'll go to +6 decibels on the camera, where it's doing the most work to amplify the sounds that it's getting. So what we're expecting is when the preamp is doing the most work, i.e. it's a +6 to be as sensitive as possible, we're expecting a higher noise floor at that point, and that's where the difference between an XLR mic and a preamp in a camera is going to come in. But let's see if you think it's good enough to pass as it is. I'll leave it to you to decide whether the preamps in these cameras is going to be good enough for your needs in terms of sound quality and the noise floor. Personally, I think unless your audience or clients are very particular when it comes to sound quality, or if the sounds you're recording are really high in the mix and nothing else is competing with it, the preamps do a very good job for me. Okay, so your batteries are charged, your SD cards have been formatted. Let's talk about getting the camera ready for your run and gun shoot. A checklist for these key points that I'm about to walk through will be given in the student materials. First of all, let's talk about picture profiles. So throughout this course, I've been talking about using Cine-D and Log quite a lot, and that's because they come with advantage for things like dynamic range and grading. But actually, Natural will give you a nice looking image with minimal grading in post. Now don't get me wrong, you can still grade it by all means and you'll still get a really good looking image. But you just can't push it quite as far as you might do with Log or Cine-D. But that's not to say that Natural doesn't have its uses, and definitely in a professional setting as well. My next point is obvious, so I'll make it quick, and that's my recommendation that you try and shoot in 4K. Obviously, if you want slow motion beyond 60p, that's not going to be possible, or if you want to shoot 10-bit slower than 30p, but it's worth remembering going in what you're missing out on if you don't shoot in 4K, such as reframing or adding pans and tilts in post like this. This shot was taken completely locked down on a tripod without the camera moving at all, with just the action being done in post. I think this is particularly important in the run and gun section because it means you don't necessarily need to take a pan or a tilt head on your tripod, or you might not have one to hand. My next suggestion is that you think really carefully about allocating the function buttons to your key features. I would suggest working with X-Telephoto, the waveform, histogram, toggle, and the stabilizer button assigned to physical buttons on the camera so you can get them quickly. I like X-Telephoto on this function 2 button here. This is right next to the punch-in button for getting your focus, so my mind is already set on thinking this is the area to get closer in. I use function 1 button here along the top to toggle my waveform and my histogram and the vector scope. So this for me deserves to be up here because this is where all the exposure stuff is. So the waveform being so big, you need to be able to get rid of it in a pinch if you have to. Then lastly, I use this button here for my stabilizer, right by the lens. Just makes sense under the finger. Don't forget, all you need to do to set a button to a function is hold that button down and then go through the functions to pick the one you want. The next point is so critical it's obvious as well, and that's to ensure that your custom menu has got all your favourites in it. The GH5 and GH5S have so many different kinds of menus. They're enormously long and not very intuitive. So this custom menu here, shown by the little purple person, is where you can put all the ones that you need access to really quickly in the same place. Personally, I couldn't live without things like changing the picture profiles, the 4K and HD, etc., the stabilizer, variable frame rate modes, mic level adjust. These are all things you really need access to quickly in a run and gun situation. To set this up, go into the menu itself, then click on My Menu Setting, hit Add, troll through the 9,000 options that the GH5 and GH5S have got, find the one you want, and then just enter on it and hit Save. By the way, just a quick note why I add stabilizer in there as well, because I mentioned stabilizer is attached to a button as well. The thing is, when you're using the button, you don't get the option to use IS lock, which is super handy for video shooting, especially in a run and gun situation. So that's why I have the menu option as well. If I want IS lock on, I have to go into my custom menu. The next one I'd argue is relevant whether you're doing run and gun videography or not. As long as you're not doing photos, I would just change the monitor to video priority mode. This is picture mode and it's not a million miles away, but for example at the top the picture settings aren't too clear. And if you're a fan of using this full screen option, you'll see that you don't even get a volume monitor at all. So to change it, you go to the wrench with the C menu. Under the monitor/display option, which is page 6, you'll see the video priority display option. Click into that and turn that on and off as you please. So in video priority mode, you'll notice that the frame rate there is quite prominent at the top of the monitor at 50p. And also if you use the full screen mode, you've now got the mic reading on the right. So next up, we're going to look at storage. And this breaks down into two for me. First of all, you need to make sure that you've got coverage for all of the footage that you're going to need to shoot on your shoot. So have a look at the memory chart from earlier to see how much footage each SD card can hold. Make sure you've got enough to cover what you need on your shooting day. Secondly, then you've got to consider whether you can afford to use the GH5 and GH5S's option to duplicate the recording to the second SD card in the slot. To set that up, go into your wrench menu, and then on page 4 you've got the double slot function. First of all, tell it what you want it to do. Relay mode, as it shows here, means that once one card is full it just moves on to the second. That'll obviously give you the most recording time. Then you've got backup rec, which means it will record simultaneously to your slot 1 and slot 2 SD cards. That's in case you're scared of one getting corrupted. Then lastly, your third option is the allocation rec, which is where it sends photo to one SD card and video to the other. So that's storage. Have you got enough memory to cope with what you need to shoot? And secondly, have you got so much that you can actually back up what you're shooting in real time, so you've got 2 SD cards in case one of them fails? So next, let's think about the power situation for your shoot. Have you got enough juice in the batteries that you own to get you through the whole shoot? Or do you need to think about switching to charging those batteries as soon as one of them dies? Remember the figures I gave earlier about how long each battery is going to last was just in a test situation. So this 2.5 hours that you get on a regular Panasonic battery is not a guaranteed 2.5 hours every time you use one. It'll depend on how much stress you're putting on the camera. So are you shooting in slow motion? Are you shooting in 4K? Are you using handheld stabilized stuff quite a lot and putting the stabilizer through work? Those will all impact these figures, so don't expect this every time you use the battery. If you already know in advance that power is going to be tight, then consider using the EVF instead of the LCD monitor, or turning the stabilizer off as soon as you can. I power down between every take, for example, and that helps me get further. There are a couple of other options I'll walk you through here. So first of all, you can decrease the luminance of the LCD monitor if you absolutely need to use it, so that lowering the brightness of it will just help the batteries last a bit longer. If you're going to be working outside, you might need maximum brightness, but otherwise, to turn it down, you go into this wrench menu, page 2, monitor luminance, and options 1 to 3 here are the brightness. 3 is the least bright, and then 1 is the brightest. I leave it on A for automatic, so when I'm outside, it bumps up the brightness, but when I'm inside, it saves me some power. Another quick tip to save power is this live view mode. So you get the choice to see footage in 30p or 60p on this monitor. And what I would suggest is changing this down to 30p. It'll save the battery, and honestly I couldn't really tell the difference. Next up, we're talking about standard profiles. So before you shoot, you want to set some standard profiles on your C1 to C3 options on the dials. This makes it super quick on the day to be able to switch between certain profile settings. I normally have 1 as my standard speed, C2 as a slow motion, and C3 as a super slow motion. C3, by the way, gives you 2 more options, so you can set 5 in total. With the dial set to C3, hitting the menu button lets you switch between C1, 2 or 3. As well as different levels of slow motion, you could use it, for example, if you knew you were going to be shooting indoors as well as outdoors. You could have one profile which was set to a higher exposure with an indoor kind of white balance, and then you could have an outside one as well to flip to when you go outside. So to save your settings as a custom menu, you go on the wrench and then hit custom menu, and then you pick which one you want to overwrite. Then when you're mid-shoot and you want to flip back to those slow motion settings or the indoor setting, it's just a case of turning that wheel on the top and then you're back to the settings that you saved. Okay, next up, I would make sure that your focus peaking and zebras are on. These are great features on these cameras. So the focus peaking gives you an outline like this to indicate what the camera thinks is in focus, and I rely on this a lot. Pulling focus is easy using the EVF, but otherwise if you want to use the monitor, it's really invaluable. So how to set it? You go to the wrench C menu, pick monitor display, and there you'll see the peaking option. Go to set to determine how sensitive you want the function to work. I like high because even if it's hard to tell, I want it to give me some indication of what's in focus, and then pick which color you want to give as your indication of what's in focus. I like green the most. So that's peaking. Zebras, if you don't know, show you which parts of the frame are exposed to a certain light value. To me, it's most useful set to show what's overexposed, i.e. where you will see pure white with no details retained in editing. I know when I'm shooting then, for example, that if I want the area around the flame to be visible, I need to back down the exposure. To turn it on, it's in the same menu as the peaking, so you're in the C menu under monitor display, it's page 7, and it's zebra pattern. So click into that and you can set 2 presets of what light exposure you want to trigger the zebras. I sometimes use 95% and 100%, but both are used to indicate to me what's overexposed. You then pick whichever preset you want to apply. Another useful way of using the zebras could be if you were using a grey card and you knew that grey card should have a luminance value of say 40%. You could set your zebras to about 45%, then expose the image on the camera so that you can see the zebras on the grey card, and then just back off the exposure a little bit until the zebras disappear. You then know that your grey card is about the 40% level you're aiming for. Okay, on to my last tip, and it's a one-worder. Carabiners. 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 Yeah, these metal things on the end of the straps that I've got here. I just find that if I'm using a gimbal, I want to be able to get the straps off really quickly. These will help, and then getting them back on if I'm going handheld, this makes the process a lot quicker than untying and undoing the hooks every time. In terms of the best practices to employ while you're out on a run and gun shoot, I break this into two categories. First of all, everything that you need to consider when you're changing scene or location. And second of all, things that you should be checking while you're rolling. Again, if you want to use this as a checklist to use while you're out in the field, I'll provide these key points in the notes in the student materials. So for every change of scene, the first thing I recommend you do is check your audio levels and adjust your mic adjustment setting accordingly. Try and use the levels that are given on the LCD or the EVF to work out what your loudest noise will be and to make sure it doesn't peak, i.e. go red on the levels, when the camera records it. Likewise for dialogue, I like that to level at about -12 dB as an average, allowing it to go higher than that but obviously still not peaking. Set your exposure and your white balance for every new scene as well. I explain how to do this in its own video in the first section. If possible, while you're rolling, get a shot of your talent or whatever people you're filming, holding up your grey card, even if it's a budget little tiny card one that I've been using, just so that in post you can adjust the exposure and the colours if you need to. With the mic level fixed, your exposure set and your white balance sorted, it might be a good idea to save down your custom profile now, so that in case the camera's turned off or you come back to this scene later, you can always get back to these settings. Now's a good time to check your battery levels, especially if you're shooting a long scene or a long event. I change batteries when I see it down to 1 bar if I can, and that flashing red bar only gives you 5 minutes on a general Panasonic battery, so that's really not long at all. If you are trying to conserve battery, I recommend using the EVF from the eyepiece rather than the LCD monitor, or if you need to use the LCD monitor, make sure the brightness is down. Turning the camera off between takes or whenever you can will obviously help the battery last longer, but obviously you want to have used the custom memory to set your settings down before you turn it off, otherwise when you turn it back on you'll have to readjust your exposure and your white balance again. Also the stabilization eats up the battery as well, so if you're on a tripod remember to turn it off, or otherwise turn it off whenever you don't think you need it. Make sure you've got enough memory left on your SD cards for what you're about to shoot, or at least if you're using 2 cards that one of them isn't full, so that when the other does fill up you're able to hot swap in another one without breaking your flow of filming. The time remaining of course is shown in the bottom right hand corner of the monitor, and it will give you an indication as well of which SD card it's looking at. So everything's set and ready. If your subject is going to be still, it's a good idea as well to get your focus. So use that focus peaking and the MF assist, which is the punch in, to make sure you've got what you want in focus. Okay, so you're all set and you're ready to go. Hit that record button and make sure that red dot starts flashing and your timer starts counting, because it's so easy to think that you're rolling when you're actually not. Even once you've started rolling, you can't switch off. It's good practice to keep checking certain things. It's easy for things like the audio levels in your scene to change without you noticing, so it's good practice to keep checking that your audio levels are good and you're not peaking. Likewise, if you've got a moving subject, even if it's a talking head, make sure that focus is maintained throughout. Keep an eye on that battery level so it doesn't run out at a really bad time. Keep an eye on your exposure as well, so make sure there's nothing that's too dark in the scene or the highlights aren't blowing out, giving you the zebras on the screen. Either of those could be bad news for you in post. And it's always good practice just to periodically check that that red light is still flashing and you're still rolling.